The morning Anna Merriweather buckled the last leather strap on her trunk. Her hands were shaking so badly she missed the clasp 3 times, and she told herself it was the cold October air drifting through the broken windowpane she had never bothered to fix because her husband had always promised he would get to it, and now he never would. The year was 1882, and Clearwater Creek, Wyoming territory, was not the kind of place that held onto its widows gently. It swallowed them whole, ground them down between the millstones of hard winters and harder men, and spat them out thinner and quieter than they had arrived. Anna had arrived 7 years ago as a bride of 22, full of optimism and a belief that the West held promise for those willing to work for it. She was 29 now, and the only promise the West had delivered was a pine box in the churchyard with her husband's name carved into it. Thomas Merriweather had been dead for months. A fever had taken him in June, fast and merciless, the way fevers in the territory tended to work. One week he was out mending the eastern fence line, sunburned and humming something off-key. The next week he was burning from the inside, his eyes glassy, his hands too hot to hold. By the third week, Anna was standing at his grave with Reverend Calloway's voice washing over her like water over stone, hearing none of it. She had kept the farm running through July and August through sheer obstinate will, rising before dawn, working until her back ached so deeply she could not tell where fatigue ended and grief began. But the farm was mortgaged, and the bank in Laramie held the note, and the bank in Laramie was not in the business of extending charity to widows who could not make their payments. The letter from the bank had arrived in September, formal and cold and utterly without apology. The property would revert to the bank's holdings at the end of October if the outstanding balance was not met in full. Anna did not have the money. She had known from the moment Thomas died that she would not have the money. She had written to her sister in St. Louis, who had written back with genuine sorrow and the regret that her own household's finances were stretched to breaking. She had approached 3 different men in town about purchasing the farm's livestock and equipment at a fair price, and each of them had offered her something so shamefully low she had walked away from the conversation without a word. So she was leaving. She was going back to St. Louis, to her sister's narrow house on Maple Street, to a life of helping with her sister's children and sleeping in the small room off the kitchen. It was not the life she had imagined, but imagination was a luxury she could no longer afford. The trunk sat in the middle of the bedroom floor. It was not a large trunk. 7 years of life in the territory, and everything she was taking with her fit inside it with room to spare. The things she was leaving behind were mostly too heavy or too worn to bother with. The cast-iron stove, the 3-legged chair Thomas had never finished repairing, the curtains she had sewn the first winter they were here when the loneliness was so sharp, she needed something to do with her hands in the evenings. She carried the trunk to the front porch herself because there was no one to help her carry it, and she set it down beside the door and stood for a moment looking out at the land. The cottonwoods along the creek had gone gold and amber, and the sky above the mountains was the particular shade of blue that existed only in Wyoming in autumn, a color so clean and so impossibly vast that it made her chest ache. She had loved this land, even when it had been unkind to her. She supposed she always would. The stage to Laramie was coming through Clearwater Creek at noon the next day. She had booked her passage. She had said her goodbyes to the few people in town who warranted them. All that remained was one last night in the house, and then she would be gone. She turned to go back inside, and that was when she saw it. It was lying on the top step of the porch, set deliberately against the riser as though placed there by careful hands. At first she thought it was a folded newspaper, but newspapers were brown and brittle and this paper was creamy white, folded in thirds like a business letter. She bent and picked it up, and the moment she unfolded it, the words on the page stopped her breathing entirely. It was a deed. A property deed, officially drawn up and stamped, for the Merriweather farm, all 43 acres of it, including the farmhouse, the barn, the outbuildings, the rights to the creek water, and the eastern pasture where the best grass grew. The deed was made out to a name she did not immediately recognize, Albert Fletcher. The name had been crossed out, not hastily or sloppily, but in a single deliberate line of ink, as though someone had thought carefully about what they were doing before they did it. And above it, written in the same careful hand, was her name, Anna Merriweather. She read it 3 times. Then she sat down on the trunk she had just hauled to the porch and read it a 4th time. The deed was real. She could see the notary's seal pressed into the lower corner. She could see the date, October 14, 1882, 3 days ago. Whoever had purchased this farm from the bank in Laramie had done so 3 days ago, paid whatever amount the bank had demanded, and then signed the deed over to her and left it on her porch without so much as knocking on her door. Albert Fletcher. She did not know the name. She turned it over in her mind, searching her memory for any connection to Clearwater Creek, and came up empty. She stood up, folded the deed carefully, tucked it inside her dress against her heart, and went back into the house to think. She did not sleep much that night. She lay on the bed she had shared with Thomas for 7 years and stared at the ceiling and tried to make sense of what had happened. Someone had paid her debt. Someone had handed her back the thing she was losing, and whoever had done it had not stayed to receive her thanks, had not left a note of explanation, had simply crossed out their own name and written in hers and walked away. The stage to Laramie would come at noon. If she got on it, she would be gone and the deed would be hers, and whoever Albert Fletcher was, she would never know. She was at the sheriff's office by 8 the following morning. Sheriff Boyd Harkins was a large, slow-moving man who had been the law in Clearwater Creek for 11 years, and approached most situations with the measured pace of a man who had seen everything at least twice. He looked up from his desk when Anna came through the door, and his expression shifted from surprise to a kind of careful courtesy. "Mrs. Merriweather," he said, rising, "didn't expect to see you this morning, thought you were leaving today." "I was," she said, and laid the deed on his desk. "Do you know who this man is?" The sheriff picked up the deed and read it in the unhurried way he did everything. He turned it over, examined the notary's seal, read the front again. Then he set it down and leaned back in his chair and looked at her with something that was not quite surprise. "Albert Fletcher," he said. "Yeah, I know him some. He runs a small cattle operation about 12 miles south of here, out past the Denison River. Came to the territory maybe 3 years back, keeps to himself mostly. Decent man from what I've seen of him, quiet." "Do you know why he would do this?" Anna asked. The sheriff shook his head slowly. "No, ma'am, I can't say I do, but if you want to know, I expect you'd have to ride out and ask him." Anna looked at the deed on the desk. She looked at it for a long moment. Then she said, "Which road?" The sheriff blinked. "Beg pardon. Which road do I take to get to his place?" he told her. She went back to the house, untied her horse from the post where she had left him saddled in anticipation of riding to meet the stage, and turned him south instead. She had 2 hours before the noon stage. She would not make it in time. She had already understood that before she left the sheriff's office, and she had made her peace with it somewhere between the door and the hitching post. The road south was a dirt track that wound through scrub and sage and the occasional stand of pine, following the land's natural contours rather than fighting them. The sky was vast and pale blue above her, and the air smelled of autumn and distant snow. She rode at a steady pace, not rushing, not quite, because she was not sure what she was going to say when she got there and she wanted to think it through. What she knew: a stranger had paid her debt. A stranger had given her back her farm. A stranger had not asked for anything in return. What she could not understand: why? She found the Fletcher property without difficulty because the sheriff's directions had been precise. It was a modest operation, smaller than her own farm, with a low ranch house built of rough-cut timber and a barn that showed signs of recent repair. There was a corral with 6 horses in it, a chicken yard, a kitchen garden that had been put to bed for winter. The whole place had the look of something being built slowly and carefully by a man working alone. She dismounted at the gate and called out, as was proper, before entering. The man who came around the corner of the barn was perhaps 33 or 34, lean and broad-shouldered in the way of men who worked with their hands every day, with brown hair that wanted cutting and eyes that were the color of creek water in the shade. He wore a work shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbow despite the October chill, and he stopped when he saw her, and something moved through his expression too quickly for her to name it. "Albert Fletcher," she said. "Yes, ma'am." His voice was low and even. She held up the deed. From 20 feet away he would have been able to see it clearly. She watched him look at it, and she watched something shift in his jaw, a tightening, as though he had been hoping for more time before this moment arrived. "You left this on my porch," she said. It was not a question. He did not try to pretend it was. "I did," he said. She walked toward him and stopped at a respectful distance and looked at him directly, because she had always believed that difficult conversations should be conducted with a person's full attention. "Why?" she said. He was quiet for a moment. He looked at the deed in her hand, and then he looked at her, and there was nothing evasive in his expression, only a kind of careful honesty that she had not expected. "Because it wasn't right," he said. "What was happening to you? You worked that land. You built something on it. That bank had no business taking it the way they were taking it. Banks in the territory have every legal right to foreclose on a mortgage in default," Anna said, because she was not a woman who needed her circumstances softened. "Legal and right aren't always the same thing," he said. She looked at him. "You spent a significant sum of money on a piece of property you then signed over to a woman you don't know." "I do know you," he said, and then seemed to realize how that sounded and added, "By reputation, I mean. People in town speak well of you. And I saw you last spring at the Callaway Church social. You wouldn't remember me, I wasn't introduced." She studied him carefully. He was not a man who found it easy to say things like that. She could see it in the way his shoulders had gone slightly stiff. He had said it anyway. "You should have knocked," she said. "I would have refused." The corner of his mouth moved. "I know," he said. "That's why I didn't knock." Anna stood there in the autumn morning with the deed in her hand and looked at this man she had never met and felt something she had not expected to feel, a thread of warmth running through the cold that had lived inside her since June. She did not trust it. She did not have enough information to trust it, but she noticed it. "I can't simply accept this," she said. "You already own it," he said. "The deed is legal, it's recorded." "That's not what I mean." She folded the deed and held it against herself. "Mr. Fletcher, I am not a woman who accepts charity." "It's not charity," he said. "Charity is when a person gives what they can spare. I bought your farm because it was the right thing to do, and I don't expect anything in return." He paused. "But if it would sit easier with you, think of it as a neighbor doing what neighbors are supposed to do." She looked at him for a long moment. "Are you always this direct?" "I find it saves time," he said. Despite everything, despite the grief and the exhaustion and the bewilderment of the morning, she almost smiled. She caught it before it fully formed. "I need to think about this," she said. "Of course," he said. She remounted her horse. She looked down at him from the saddle. "I missed my stage," she said. "I'm sorry," he said, and she believed he meant it. She rode back toward Clearwater Creek in the thin October sunlight, and by the time she reached the edge of town she had made a decision. She was going to stay. Not because the deed had settled everything, it had not. Not because the farm's problems were suddenly solved, they were not. The livestock was still depleted, the equipment was still worn, the winter was coming, and she was still alone. But she was going to stay because leaving felt wrong now in a way it had not felt wrong this morning, and she had learned over 29 years to pay attention to that particular feeling. She booked passage on the following week's stage, just in case she changed her mind. Then she went home and unpacked her trunk. 3 days passed before she saw him again. She was at Purcell's General Store, pricing seed stock and making calculations on the back of a piece of paper that left her with a number she could not quite meet, when the door opened behind her and she heard Harlan Purcell say, "Fletcher, how do?" in the easy voice he used with people he liked. She turned around. Albert Fletcher had cleaned up since she had seen him at the ranch. He was wearing a good shirt and a hat that was not as battered as the one he had been wearing in the barn, and he was carrying a list of supplies in one hand. He saw her immediately and stopped for a fraction of a second before continuing to the counter. "Mrs. Merriweather," he said. His voice was exactly as she remembered it. "Mr. Fletcher," she said. An awkward silence of about 4 seconds, which was long enough for Harlan Purcell to develop a sudden intense interest in the shelves behind him. "I thought you were leaving," Albert said. "I decided to stay," she said. "For now." He nodded. He did not look surprised. He did not look pleased either, or at least he was careful not to show it in a way that could be easily read. "The farm," she said. "I've been thinking about what I need to get through the winter. My livestock is short. I had to sell the 2 work horses in August, and my seed stores are nearly depleted." She did not know why she was telling him this. She had not planned to tell him this, but he listened without interrupting, his hat in his hands now, his expression attentive. "I have 2 draft horses I'd be willing to loan you through spring," he said when she had finished. "And I have more seed than I'll need, oats and winter rye. I'm not going to take charity," she said, for the second time in 3 days. "Trade then," he said. "Help with my harvest when spring comes and I need extra hands." She looked at him. It was an arrangement that made practical sense. It was also the kind of arrangement that people in a small town would talk about, and she knew it, and she suspected he knew it too. "All right," she said. "Trade." He gave her a single nod. It was businesslike and unembellished, and she appreciated it. He brought the horses 2 days later, driving them down her road in the early morning, a matched pair of dapple grays who were better animals than anything she had lost. He helped her settle them in the barn without being asked, checking the stalls and the water trough with a quiet efficiency that suggested he had been in and out of barns all his life. She stood in the barn doorway watching him work and noticed that he moved without wasted motion, a quality she had always found more attractive than she probably should have. He left without staying for coffee, which she had intended to offer. She stood in the doorway watching him ride south until he disappeared over the rise, and then she turned and went inside and stood at the kitchen stove for longer than necessary, looking at the kettle. November came in cold and clean, with frost on the windows every morning and ice along the creek edges. Anna threw herself into the work of winterizing the farm with a determination that had as much to do with not thinking as with practical necessity. She repaired the barn roof with lumber she bought on credit from Purcell, using techniques Thomas had taught her. She put up the kitchen garden's last stragglers. She banked the foundation of the house against the coming cold. She saw Albert Fletcher perhaps once a week, in town mostly, at the store or the post office. Their conversations were brief and practical, about weather and livestock and the state of the roads. Each time, there was something underneath the practicality that neither of them named, a quality of attention that went beyond mere neighborliness, a small extra care in the way he listened when she spoke. She began to think about him in the evenings, which annoyed her. She would be reading by the fire or mending something, and her mind would drift to something he had said, the slight dry turn in his voice when he was being gently humorous, the way he had looked at her that first day at his ranch with that expression she still could not quite name. She told herself she was grateful to him, which was true, and that gratitude could feel remarkably like something else, which was also true, and that she needed to be sensible, which she was doing her best to be. Thomas had been dead 5 months. It was too soon to feel anything for anyone. She told herself this with some regularity. In mid-November, a situation arose that required her to go out to his ranch again. One of the dapple grays had developed a limp that she could not diagnose herself, and she did not want to make a mistake with a borrowed animal. She rode out to the Fletcher property on a gray afternoon when the sky sat low and heavy with the suggestion of snow. He was in the corral when she arrived, working with a young horse, and he stopped when he heard her coming and came to the gate. She explained the situation. He listened, asked 2 questions, and then said he would come have a look first thing the next morning. He came as promised, examined the horse with the attentive patience of a man who understood animals, and determined that it was nothing serious, a stone bruise that would resolve with rest. He showed her what to look for, walking her through it with the matter-of-fact clarity of a good teacher. When he was done, she said, "Stay for coffee." He looked at her for a moment. "All right," he said. They sat at the kitchen table, which was the first time they had sat in the same room together for any extended period, and the reality of it was both ordinary and remarkable. He drank his coffee black and held the cup with both hands the way men did when they were not quite comfortable. She sat across from him and understood for the first time that he was nervous, and the realization was so surprising and so oddly touching that she had to look at her own cup to hide her expression. "Where did you come from?" she asked. "Before Wyoming." "Kansas," he said. "Dodge City originally. Then I spent some time in Colorado." "What brought you here?" He considered the question as though it deserved a real answer. "I wanted land," he said. "Land that was mine and only mine. Land I'd built something on. In Kansas I was working for other men. Good men mostly, but still." He paused. "And Dodge City in the late '70s was not a restful place to be." She smiled, and it was the first real smile she had produced in his presence, and she saw him notice it. "What about you?" he said. "You're not from here originally." "Ohio," she said. "Cincinnati. I met Thomas there, and he had already decided to come west. I decided with him." "Did you regret it?" She thought about it honestly, the way the question deserved. "No," she said, "not the decision. I loved this land even when it was hard. I still do." She looked out the window at the winter-brown fields. "I just wish—" She stopped. "I know," he said quietly. They sat in the comfortable silence that sometimes comes between people who understand each other better than they have any right to yet, given how little time they have spent together. The fire popped in the stove. Outside, the first flakes of the season's first real snow began to drift past the window. "You should probably head home before it comes in hard," she said. He looked at the window and agreed and stood. He was not a man who prolonged goodbyes unnecessarily. He put on his coat and his hat and thanked her for the coffee in a voice that was warmer than the words themselves. At the door he turned. "Mrs. Merriweather," he said, "I'm glad you didn't get on that stage." She looked at him. He held her gaze steadily, not with boldness, but with that same quality of careful honesty she had noticed at their first meeting. "So am I," she said. "I think." He nodded once and went out into the falling snow. December settled the territory in earnest, and Clearwater Creek became the kind of place that seemed to pull its residents in from the cold and hold them close, with neighbors checking on neighbors and the general store becoming a gathering place in the long afternoons. Anna fell into a rhythm of work and quiet, and she found, to her surprise, that the quiet did not feel as empty as it had in the autumn. She was still grieving Thomas, a grief that came in waves rather than a steady tide now, hitting hardest in unexpected moments, the smell of wood smoke on a cold morning, the sound of a horse's hooves on the frozen road. But she was also alive in a way she had feared she might not be able to be again. Albert Fletcher came by her farm twice in December, once to deliver the promised seed stores before the deepest cold set in, and once, near Christmas, to see whether she needed anything from town as he was making the trip. Both visits were brief and practical. Both times she offered coffee and he accepted, and they sat across the table from each other and talked with an increasing ease that she noticed and noted and refused to examine too closely. On his second December visit, he brought her something. He produced it from his coat pocket with a slight awkwardness that suggested he had debated the gesture considerably. A small tin of good tea, from the store in Laramie, the kind you could not get at Purcell's. "I know you're not the charity type," he said before she could speak, "so consider this a Christmas gift which is different." She looked at the tin. She looked at him. "It is different," she agreed. "Thank you, Mr. Fletcher." "Albert," he said, "if you want." She held the tin in both hands. "Anna," she said, "it was a small thing. It was also not a small thing at all. January came in ferocious and stayed that way, with blizzards that pinned people indoors for days at a time and temperatures that split fence rails and froze the creek solid enough to walk on. Anna weathered it with her stove and her books and the dapple grays in the barn, who needed tending even when everything else could wait. She thought about Albert during the worst of the storms, whether he was managing all right 12 miles south, whether his barn was holding, whether he had enough firewood. The thinking was no longer something she tried to prevent. In the second week of January, when a break in the weather lasted long enough to make travel safe, she found herself riding south without having quite consciously decided to. She told herself she was checking on the horses. She told herself this was a perfectly reasonable practical errand. He was home, as she had expected. He was splitting wood in the yard when she rode up, and he stopped mid-swing and looked at her with an expression that was somewhere between surprise and something she did not let herself name yet. "I was in the area," she said, which was not quite true, given that his ranch was 12 miles from town and she had ridden specifically here. He set the axe down against the chopping block. "Come inside," he said. "It's cold." The inside of his ranch house was spare and functional, with the particular quality of a space organized by a person living alone who has thought carefully about what he actually needs. There was a good stone fireplace, a solid table, shelves with a surprising number of books, and a window that faced south to catch the winter light. It was not warm exactly, but it was warmer than outside, and he put more wood on the fire and put the coffee pot on without asking, which she liked. She noticed the books because she was a reader and always had been, and she began to look at the spines while the coffee heated, calling out the titles as she found them, and he answered from the kitchen area with brief comments, and somehow this turned into a real conversation about books that lasted long enough that the afternoon light changed around them, and she realized she had been here for 2 hours. She had not had a conversation like this, a conversation that ranged freely and with mutual interest across many subjects, since before Thomas's illness. The realization hit her with a kind of ache that was not entirely unpleasant. "I should go before dark," she said, with genuine reluctance. He walked her out to her horse, as was proper, and held the animal steady while she mounted. He looked up at her in the fading light with those creekwater eyes, and she thought she could see something in them that was very like what she felt in her own chest when she was not being careful enough about preventing it. "It's a long ride back," he said. "Cold. I've ridden in worse." "I know you have," he said. There was something in the way he said it, a quiet acknowledgment of her competence and her toughness that moved through her like warm water. "I'll see you in town," she said. "You will," he said. She rode home in the January dark with stars beginning to emerge above the mountains and her breath clouding in the cold air, and she felt, for the first time in 7 months, genuinely alive. In February, Clearwater Creek began to talk. Small towns in the Wyoming Territory in 1882 had limited entertainment and unlimited interest in their neighbor's business, and Anna Merriweather and Albert Fletcher had been seen together in Purcell's General Store on 3 occasions in January, and once after Sunday services at Reverend Calloway's church, and once at the post office sharing the counter while waiting for the post to be sorted. None of these encounters was, in isolation, remarkable. Together, they constituted what the town considered a pattern. Dorothea Marsh, who ran the boarding house and considered herself the town's primary social authority, stopped Anna on the main street one February morning with the particular expression of a woman who has been waiting for an opportunity. "Mrs. Merriweather," she said, "lovely morning. I did notice you speaking with that Fletcher man again." "Mr. Fletcher and I are neighbors," Anna said pleasantly, which was not quite accurate given the 12 miles, but was accurate enough in spirit. "Of course," said Dorothea, in a tone that conveyed she found this explanation charming in its simplicity. "He seems a decent sort, keeps to himself, not much known about him." "He is a decent sort," Anna said, with a firmness that closed the topic, and excused herself before Dorothea could open it again. She was not embarrassed by the town's attention. She had lived in Clearwater Creek long enough to understand that it was the nature of small communities to notice and to speculate, and that the speculation was generally harmless, and often meant in a kind of rough affection. What the attention did do was force her to examine her own feelings more directly than she had been managing in the privacy of her own mind. She cared about him. She had begun to care about him somewhere in the space between the first coffee at his kitchen table and the January afternoon with the books, and the caring had the quality of something that had grown quietly and steadily before she had noticed it was there. She was not yet sure what to do with it. Thomas had been dead 7 months, and she was conscious of the weight of that, the propriety of it, the simple grief of it. She was not a woman who took such things lightly. But she was also 29 years old and still breathing and possessed of a heart that had apparently not received the message about remaining quiet. Albert himself gave no direct indication of his feelings, except in the aggregate accumulation of small things. The way he always managed to be on the same side of town as she was when she came in for supplies. The way he had remembered that she took her coffee with no sugar after she had mentioned it once in November. The way his face changed, in some quality of attention that was difficult to articulate but impossible to miss, when she entered a room he was in. The weather broke in mid-February, not into warmth exactly, but into the particular kind of cold that sits clear and still and almost bearable after the violence of deep winter. Anna rode out to see him again on a clear Thursday, and this time she did not pretend it was anything other than what it was. He was repairing tack in the barn when she arrived, sitting on an overturned crate with a bridle across his knees and a punch in his hand, and he looked up when her shadow fell through the barn doorway with an expression she finally allowed herself to read. It was glad. He was glad to see her. "I have a question," she said, sitting down on the spare crate without being invited to, because she had been coming here long enough that she no longer waited for invitations. "All right," he said, setting the bridle aside. "That first day," she said, "when you left the deed. You said you knew me by reputation and that you'd seen me at the church social in the spring, but people do not spend significant sums of money to save a farm for a woman they have seen once at a church social." He was quiet. "I'd like the honest answer," she said. He looked at her for a moment and she could see him deciding. "You're right," he said. "It wasn't once at a church social." He put the punch down on the crate beside him. "I came to Clearwater Creek in the summer of 1879, from Colorado. The first person I spoke to who treated me like a neighbor rather than a stranger was Thomas Merriweather. He was picking up feed from Purcell's, and I was standing there trying to figure out the lay of the land, and he just started talking to me, telling me about the territory, pointing out who was who. He invited me to Sunday dinner that same week." Anna was very still. "I had dinner at your table," he said. "June of 1879. You made a roast and there were biscuits, and you argued Thomas into letting the dog inside because it was raining. Thomas was so proud of that farm and so clearly devoted to you that I felt like a man looking through a window at something fine." She remembered distantly a tall, quiet man at her table who had not said much but had been very polite and had helped clear the plates without being asked. She had not connected that man to the Albert Fletcher she knew now, but the description fitted. "I didn't come back to Clearwater Creek regularly until about a year after that," he continued. "By then Thomas was already sick, and then he was gone and you were going to lose everything, and it just seemed—" He stopped. He picked the punch up and set it down again in a gesture that had nothing to do with the tool. "It seemed like the wrong thing was happening to the right person, and I was in a position to do something about it." "So you did," she said. "So I did." The barn was quiet except for the horses moving in their stalls and the small sounds of wind against the timber. Anna looked at him, this man who had sat at her table 3 years ago and remembered the dog and the rain and the biscuits, and felt the thread of warmth that had started in October become something considerably less like a thread. "Albert," she said. "Anna," he said, and in the way he said it, without embellishment, without anything more than the plainness of her name in his voice, she heard everything he had not yet directly said. She stood up. He stood up. They were close as the width of a barn crate, and she looked up at him and said, You should have told me sooner. You were grieving, he said. I was, she said. I still am in some ways. Grief doesn't have an end date exactly. She looked at him steadily. But I am also still here, and so are you, and I would very much like to not talk around things anymore. He reached out and took her hand, slowly enough that she could have moved away if she'd wanted to, and she did not want to. His hand was warm and roughened from work, and his grip was careful. I am not a man of many words, he said. I've noticed that, she said. I find it suits me. He looked at their joined hands and then at her face. I've thought about you every day since October, he said. Since before October, if I'm being honest. I know, she said. I have thought about you too. He raised her hand slightly, a question, and she answered it by stepping closer, and he bent his head and kissed her with the same careful deliberateness that characterized everything he did. A kiss that was quiet and earnest and so full of something that had been waiting patiently for months that she felt it settle into her chest like warmth after cold. When it ended, she rested her forehead against his jaw for a moment, just a moment, and listened to the horses and the wind and the steady sound of his breathing. I should tell you, she said, her voice slightly unsteady, that I am not an easy woman to know. I have opinions and I am stubborn, and I spent 7 years building something on hard land and I intend to keep building. I know all of that, he said. His arm had come around her shoulders in a natural, careful way. I knew it from June of 1879, when you argued Thomas into letting the dog in from the rain. She laughed. It was the first real laugh she had managed since before Thomas died, and it surprised her with its own existence, and she felt something loosen in her chest that had been tight for a very long time. Spring arrived in the territory the way it always did, gradually and then all at once, with crocuses along the creek bank in March and mud in April that made the roads nearly impassable, and the fields work that needed doing. Anna and Albert settled into something that was both more and less defined than courtship, as the town understood it. They helped each other with the farm work, which was practical and proper. They had supper together on Sunday evenings, alternating between her kitchen and his, which was rather less proper, and which gave Dorothea Marsh significant material for her conversations at the boarding house. Albert came to her farm on the first warm Saturday of April with 2 of his ranch hands, and spent the day repairing the broken window Thomas had promised to fix, and the fence line on the eastern pasture, and the hinge on the barn door. Anna cooked a real dinner for all 3 of them and sent the hands home with a jar of preserves each, and afterward she and Albert sat on the porch steps watching the last light on the mountains, and she thought she had not felt this particular kind of peace since before she could remember. People are talking, she said. It was not a complaint. It was an acknowledgement. Let them talk, he said. She looked at him sideways. Dorothea Marsh says I am moving too fast. Dorothea Marsh has been moving too slowly on everything for 30 years, and she calls it wisdom, he said. She laughed again. She had been laughing more since February, and she noticed it with a kind of grateful wonder. Albert, she said, what is this for you? He turned to look at her in the evening light, and his expression was the most openly readable she had ever seen it. Everything, he said simply. If you want it to be, she held his gaze. I want it to be, she said. He nodded once, the gesture she had come to recognize as his particular form of settled certainty. Then I'd like to ask you something, he said. And I want you to take your time and give me the honest answer and not the polite one. She turned to face him fully. Ask, she said. Would you consider marrying me, he said, understanding that I know it's soon by most people's reckoning, and I know you have been through a great deal, and I am not asking you to decide today. I am asking because I want you to know that my intentions are clear, and I am not interested in a middle position. I want to build something with you, on your land and mine, and spend however many years we are given doing that, and I would rather ask plainly and give you time than not ask at all. She looked at the mountains, which were gold and rose in the last light, and at the creek, which was running high with snowmelt, and at the farm she had nearly lost and had been given back, and she thought about Thomas, who would have wanted her to be happy, because he had been the kind of man who wanted happiness for the people he loved even when he was no longer in the room to watch over them. I will consider it, she said, "and I will give you my honest answer." He accepted this with the grace of a patient man. She gave him her honest answer 6 weeks later, on a morning in May when the wildflowers were coming up through the grass in the east pasture, and the cottonwoods along the creek were full and green. She rode out to his ranch without warning, which she did now with some regularity, and found him in the kitchen garden. "Yes," she said from horseback, because she had decided there was no reason to preamble it. He stood up from the row he was working. He looked at her for a moment with that expression she had finally, completely learned to read. "Yes," she said again, and smiled and dismounted. He crossed the garden to her in 4 strides and took both her hands in his and bent to kiss her on the forehead, and then on the mouth, and then held her face between his calloused hands and looked at her with something so full and so unguarded that she had to look away and then look back again because she wanted to see it. "I will spend the rest of my life being worth that yes," he said. "I know," she said, "and I will spend mine being worth the deed." They were married in August of 1882 at Reverend Calloway's church in Clearwater Creek, on a hot clear morning with the mountains blue in the distance and every person in town present, because even Dorothea Marsh had eventually come around, as small towns always do when they see 2 people who are genuinely and quietly devoted to each other. Anna wore a dress of dark blue wool, the best she owned, with pearl buttons Thomas had given her for their 3rd anniversary, which she wore now without guilt, because she understood that love does not work in opposition to love. She carried a small bouquet of wild columbines from the east pasture. She did not wear a veil. Albert stood at the front of the church in a clean dark suit that he had clearly not owned for very long, and when she walked through the door and down the short aisle, he looked at her the way he had looked at her in February in the barn when she had said she wanted to stop talking around things, with a complete and unhidden gladness that she felt from 20 feet away. Reverend Calloway performed the service with the particular warmth he reserved for marriages he genuinely approved of, and when it was done and Albert pressed the ring onto her finger, a plain silver band he had ridden to Laramie to purchase, he held her hand a beat longer than the ceremony required, and she let him, because there was nothing in the world she would rather have his hand holding than hers. The dinner afterward was held in the open air beside the church, because there was no hall large enough in Clearwater Creek to hold everyone who had come, and tables were brought out, and food was contributed by every household in the community, and someone had a fiddle and someone else had a guitar, and the music started before the food was even finished. Albert was not a dancer by natural inclination, but he danced with her because she loved it, one slow reel that he navigated with earnest concentration while she laughed and guided him through the tricky bit at the end, and when the reel finished, he spun her once more than the music required and held her against his chest for a moment with his chin resting on the top of her head, and she could feel him smiling. "I'm a terrible dancer," he said. "You're an acceptable dancer," she said, "and I accept you." They combined the operations of both properties over the following months in a way that required considerable planning and no small amount of compromise. Albert's 12-mile distance from town was a disadvantage, and her 43 acres, which were better watered and better positioned for farming, were the more productive land. They made the practical decision to live at her farm, the Merriweather farm, which became the Fletcher farm, which she insisted on calling the Merriweather Fletcher farm because she had helped build it and the name on the gate mattered. Albert accepted this without argument, which she loved him for. He moved his horses and his cattle to join hers, and the combined operation was immediately more viable than either had been alone. He was a better cattleman than a farmer, and she was the reverse, and the division of work that emerged between them was efficient and deeply complementary. She managed the crops and the kitchen garden and the accounts. He managed the livestock and the structural repairs and the fence lines. They both worked at everything, because the territory did not allow for rigid divisions, but each of them trusted the other's judgment in their own territory. By September, which was exactly 1 year after she had found the deed on her porch, They had twice the head of cattle they had started the year with, a repaired barn that would hold through the worst winter, a new section of fence along the north pasture, and a kitchen garden that had produced more than they could use, the surplus of which Anna put up in enough jars to last 2 winters. On the anniversary of the deed, Albert came home from the north pasture at dusk to find her sitting on the porch steps with a cup of tea, looking at the mountains. He sat down beside her. He did not ask what she was thinking, because he had learned that she would tell him when she was ready. After a while she said, "A year ago I had my trunk packed." "I know," he said. "I was going to St. Louis. I was going to sleep in the room off my sister's kitchen and help with her children and be very grateful and very small." He was quiet. "I would have been miserable," she said. "Not because of St. Louis. My sister is lovely, but because of leaving." She looked at the mountains. "I would have left the one place in the world that felt like mine, and I would have grieved it alongside Thomas, and I think it would have hollowed me out." He put his arm around her, and she leaned into his side, which was warm and solid and smelled of hay and honest work. "Who told you?" she asked. "That the farm was going to the bank. You were 12 miles away and keeping to yourself. How did you know?" "Purcell," he said. "He mentioned it in passing the first week of October. He didn't know I knew you. He was just talking about the way the bank was handling it." "And you rode to Laramie the next day," she said. 3 days later," he said. "I had to settle some things of my own first, free up the funds." She turned to look at him. "Albert, you spent everything you had, didn't you?" It was not quite a question. He met her gaze with the equanimity of a man who had made his peace with a decision a long time ago. "Most of it," he said. She held his gaze. "You spent most of your savings on a farm for a woman you had met once." "For a woman," he said carefully, "who had been kind to me when I was a stranger, and who deserved better than what was happening to her, and for whom I had," he paused, "strong feelings even then." She took his hand. She held it between both of hers, looking at the silver ring on her finger and the roughness of his knuckles, and the particular way the evening light fell across their joined hands. "Strong feelings," she repeated. "I was working up to stronger ones," he said, and there was the dry, slight warmth at the corner of his voice that she had loved since November. She kissed him, right there on the porch steps in the dusk, without warning, and felt him smile against her mouth. They had their first child in July of 1883, a boy they named Thomas Albert Fletcher, Thomas for her first husband who had been a good man and deserved to be remembered, and Albert for his father, whom she intended to have around for a very long time. The birth was attended by the territory midwife, a formidable woman named Mrs. Henriksen, and by the time it was over Anna had reconsidered several of her opinions about what constituted hard work. Albert, who had spent the duration of the birth on the porch because Mrs. Henriksen had opinions about fathers underfoot, came inside the moment he was permitted and sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the baby in Anna's arms with an expression she had never seen on him before. Something had come open in him, something that had been held in careful reserve with the caution of a man who had not had much that was purely his in the world had let go. "Thomas Albert," he said. The name in his voice was a kind of reverence. "Tom, I think," she said, "when he's older." He reached out one finger and the baby wrapped his fist around it with the instinctive grip of the newborn, and Albert laughed, a startled, genuine sound, and she watched him fall in love with his son in the span of 2 seconds and thought she could not possibly love this man more than she did right now. She was wrong about that. She came to love him more with considerable regularity. Tom grew into a bright, energetic child with his mother's dark hair and his father's quietness, and the farm grew around him. By 1885, the Merriweather Fletcher operation was one of the more prosperous small farms in the area around Clearwater Creek, not wealthy by any measure, but stable and productive in theirs. Albert had added a second barn and rebuilt the farmhouse's eastern wing, extending the kitchen and adding a proper bedroom for Tom. Anna had expanded the kitchen garden and begun selling preserves to Purcell's store, which brought in enough extra income to make a noticeable difference in the accounts. She had also taken on the bookkeeping for 2 other farms in the area whose owners were better with cattle than with numbers, and the small fees she charged for this service were another piece of the growing foundation. Albert had bought back most of what he had spent on the farm purchase by the end of 1884, not by denying it, because he was not the kind of man who thought about it in those terms, but simply by the natural accumulation of 2 people working hard together. He mentioned this to her once, in passing, and she said that the original expenditure had returned itself several hundredfold in ways that could not be entered in the account's ledger, and he had looked at her with that gladness that still had the same effect on her it had had in the February barn, 2 years previous. In 1886, the territory saw an ugly stretch of land disputes and claim jumping that affected several families in the Clearwater Creek area, including 2 of their neighbors. Albert became quietly but firmly involved in helping those families document and defend their claims, writing to Laramie twice to speak with the land office officials, and once to testify in a hearing that ultimately ruled in favor of the affected families. He did not talk about it much because he was not a man who talked about the things he did when he felt they were simply right. Anna knew about it because she kept his schedule and because she was paying attention. The injustice of what was happening to those families, many of them homesteaders who had worked land for years only to find powerful interests attempting to displace them, was something that sat in her chest with a familiar weight. She had nearly been displaced herself, by the cold, indifferent machinery of debt and banks, and the particular vulnerability of women who held property alone. The territory in 1882 was not a place that made it easy to be a woman without a man's legal standing behind her. She had not forgotten that, and she was glad that Albert had not either. By 1887, Clearwater Creek had grown. A second general store had opened, and there was a proper schoolhouse, and the church had been rebuilt in stone. The railroad was talking about extending a line through the area, which everyone understood would change things permanently, mostly for the better and some for the complex. Anna began writing a column for the small territorial newspaper in Laramie, Observations on Farming and Homesteading and Life in the Territory, written under her full name, Anna Merriweather Fletcher, because she was proud of both names and intended to be known under both. The column was received well enough that the newspaper's editor wrote to ask if she would consider writing a monthly piece rather than occasional contributions, and she said yes, because she had things to say and was not in the habit of declining opportunities to say them. Albert read every column she wrote, first in draft form at the kitchen table, then in the printed version that came with the post. He was not effusive in his praise because he was not an effusive man, but he told her once that reading her was like hearing her think, and that he had been in love with the way she thought since the first time she talked to him across his kitchen table in November of 1882, when she had disagreed with something he said about crop rotation, and done so with such precise and enjoyable authority that he had been entirely lost. "I was right about the crop rotation," she said. "I know," he said. That was the problem. She was pregnant again in the spring of 1888, which she discovered with the combination of joy and pragmatic calculation that characterized her approach to most significant developments. The farm could support another child. The house had room. Tom was 5 years old and would be a good older brother, she judged, because he had his father's patient nature. She was 35 now, and Albert was 38. And they were so thoroughly woven together in life and work, and thought that she sometimes had difficulty remembering the texture of the years before him, not because those years were not real, and not because Thomas did not remain in her heart in his proper place, but because Albert had become so much the fabric of her daily life that his absence from the years before felt like a geographical anomaly, a river running uphill. The second child was another boy, born in October of 1888, and they named him James Henry Fletcher, Henry for Albert's father who had died in Kansas years ago, and whom Albert did not speak of often but with a careful love when he did. James was louder and rounder than his brother had been as an infant, and Albert, who by now was a practiced father, navigated the new baby with a steady assurance that made Anna love him with a particular fierceness she reserved for watching him with their children. Tom, at 5, approached his baby brother with the grave scientific interest of a child who had decided to take this new development seriously. He sat beside the cradle with the concentrated attention of a researcher and announced his observations in full sentences, which was exactly the kind of child he was. And Albert sat on the other side of the cradle watching both of them with an expression of complete and uncomplicated happiness. In the spring of 1889, Wyoming was moving toward statehood, which everyone in the territory could feel building like a weather system, the particular electric quality of something large and inevitable approaching. Wyoming would be admitted to the Union in July of the following year, and with it would come a formal government and a formal legal framework, and the territory's particular status, including the progressive laws that had made Wyoming the first territory to grant women the right to vote in 1869, would be codified into statehood. Anna wrote a column about this that the Laramie newspaper ran on the front page below the fold, and which generated more correspondence than anything she had written before, a mix of agreement and argument in proportions she found satisfying. She believed in the vote and had always believed in it. She believed that women who worked land and kept accounts and raised children and made the territory function had a right to a voice in how it was governed, and she was not subtle about this belief. Albert, for his part, had always believed this too, which she had discovered early in their acquaintance and which remained one of her most foundational satisfactions about him. The summer of 1889 was good. The farm was productive, the cattle healthy, the boys growing fast. Tom was in school now and coming home with questions that required real answers, which was exactly what Anna had hoped for. James was walking and had developed the aggressive self-confidence of a second child who has worked out that he can always find an ally in his older brother. On a Sunday evening in July, Anna and Albert sat on the porch in the warm dark after the boys were asleep, with the sound of the creek and the cricket song all around them, and she leaned her head against his shoulder in the particular way she had that meant she was content and did not need to say anything. 7 years ago this fall, she said after a while, he said, 7 years ago I was packed and leaving. And I had a deed and too much hope, he said. She smiled against his shoulder. Tell me again why you crossed your name out instead of just coming to talk to me. Because you would have refused, he said, which you told me yourself. I would have, she admitted. I was so determined to refuse everything. I had convinced myself that accepting help was the same as failing. And now, she considered it honestly because she was always honest with him. Now I think there's a difference between accepting help from someone who loves you and accepting charity from someone who pities you. She paused, and also I think I was wrong about some things. About some things, he said, with the dry warmth that still, after 5 years of marriage, made her smile. Don't push it, she said. He laughed and pressed his lips to the top of her head, and she closed her eyes and listened to the Wyoming summer around them. To the sound of the land she had almost left and had stayed on and had built something real on, and felt the deep-settled peace of a life that had found its proper shape. The farm in 1890 looked nothing like the depleted property it had been in October of 1882. The fields were in full productive rotation, managed with the technique Anna had argued about with Albert that November and which had proved her right. The cattle herd was strong, a mix of the breeds Albert knew best, and there were 20 horses in the corral now, with a modest but steady trade in well-trained stock. The farmhouse had been expanded twice and sat solid and warm against the Wyoming sky, with a kitchen garden that was something of a local wonder, and a porch that wrapped 2 sides of the house, because Albert had built it that way in the 2nd year of their marriage, because she loved mornings on the porch regardless of which direction the light was coming from. Tom, 7 years old in July of 1890, was his mother's child in intellect and his father's child in temperament, combining her precision with his quietness into a quality of thoughtful observation that his teachers found remarkable. James, at 2, was chaos contained in the body of a small, determined boy who would clearly be building and breaking and rebuilding things for the rest of his natural life. Wyoming entered the Union on July 10, 1890, as the 44th state. The celebration in Clearwater Creek lasted 3 days, with music and food and the kind of communal joy that comes with something long awaited. Anna wrote about it for the newspaper, the full story of what statehood meant, the formal recognition of the women's suffrage that Wyoming had pioneered 20 years before, the legal architecture of a real government, the particular pride of people who had built something from raw land and were now watching it become officially recognized as real. Albert stood beside her at the town celebration with James on his hip and Tom at his knee, and she stood next to him and listened to the speeches and felt the particular way the territory, now a state, settled around her with a sense of permanence that was, she thought, everything she had hoped for when she first came west as a 22-year-old bride full of optimism. She had lost things here. She had grieved here. She had nearly been driven out. But she had also found here the deepest happiness of her life, in a man who had crossed his name off a deed and written hers in its place, because he believed in doing right, and in the family they had built on that foundation, and in the land itself which rewarded patient work with a generosity that never ceased to move her. In September of 1890, she discovered she was pregnant for the 3rd time, and she told Albert at the kitchen table over breakfast, simply and directly, the way she always told him things. He set his coffee cup down and looked at her with the expression she loved best on him, the one that was entirely open and entirely unguarded. "Another one," he said. "Another one," she confirmed. He reached across the table and took her hand and held it in the solid, warm way he had held it for 8 years now, and she turned her hand in his and held it back. Tom, informed at supper, received the news with the grave interest of the family's eldest, and immediately began asking questions about logistics. James, too young to understand but old enough to catch the significance in the adult's manner, climbed into Anna's lap and patted her face with both hands, which was his standard response to important occasions. The 3rd child was born in May of 1891, a girl they named Eleanor, after Anna's mother, who had died before Anna came west, and whose particular form of steady love Anna had spent her life trying to live up to. Eleanor arrived with dark hair and bright eyes, and an air of absolute certainty about her own importance that charmed everyone who met her. Albert held his daughter on the evening of her birth, with the same stunned gladness he had held Tom 8 years before, magnified by familiarity into something deeper and quieter. He looked up from Eleanor's face and met Anna's eyes across the room, and she saw in him everything she had ever needed to see in anyone, all of it, the depth and the steadiness and the particular warmth that he reserved for her alone, right alongside the warmth he had for their children, which was the same warmth at its root but expressed differently. "How are you?" he asked. "Tired," she said. "Happy, complete." He nodded in that settled way. He looked back at the baby. "Eleanor," he said, testing the name. "Eleanor," she confirmed. Tom came to see his sister that evening, solemn and careful, and held out one careful finger for her to grip, which she did, and he looked at her for a long time and then said, "She's very small." "You were very small," Anna said. "I don't remember that," he said. "No," she agreed. "You wouldn't." James, at 3, was less philosophical about the baby and more interested in whether the baby would be able to come outside and look at the horses soon. And when Albert explained that this would take some time, James accepted this information with the pragmatic impatience of a child who understood that time was something he frequently had to wait for. The farm in the early 1890s was settled and productive, and full of the particular noise and texture of a family that was genuinely thriving. There were days that were hard, because farming was always hard, and there were days when the weather was wrong or the livestock had problems or the accounts were tight. And there were still moments when Anna would catch a quality of winter light or the smell of something that would take her back to the years before 1882, and she would feel the edge of the grief for Thomas as a distant but real thing. But grief, she had come to understand, is not a subtraction from the living present. It is carried forward, incorporated, transformed. Thomas was part of the foundation of the life she had now. His name was on the grave in the churchyard and on the lips of the oldest residents of Clearwater Creek when they spoke of good men the territory had lost. He was in the name of her eldest son, who had his mother's determination and his father's capacity for honest work. He was in the land itself, the fence lines Thomas had mended, the fields Thomas had broken. And the life she had built on that foundation, the life with Albert, was not a replacement for what had been but something different, something its own full and real thing, a structure with its own architecture and its own weight and its own beauty. Clearwater Creek was larger now than it had been when she arrived in 1875. There was a school and a proper church and a second general store, and a doctor who had come out from Ohio in 1887 and stayed. The railroad had come through in 1888 and changed the character of trade, making some things easier and some things different in ways that took getting used to. The influx of new settlers that statehood brought in 1890 continued, and the town was in the process of becoming something more organized, more permanent, more like the settled communities back east that many of its residents had left. Anna watched this transformation with a writer's eye and a historian's instinct for what was being lost alongside what was being gained. She wrote about it, regularly, in the newspaper column that had continued for 6 years now, and that had become something people in the territory read with genuine interest. She wrote about the land and the farming and the particular texture of life in a place that was in the process of becoming, and she was honest in her writing about what the West's transformation cost as well as what it promised. She was also honest about the injustices that had accompanied the West's development, the displacement of the Arapaho and Shoshone peoples who had lived on this land for generations before any settler arrived, the land grabs that had made some men wealthy by taking from others, the particular cruelty of a system that had almost taken her farm because she was a widow without a man's name on the note. She was not a crusader exactly, but she was a woman who believed that seeing things clearly and saying them plainly was a form of respect for the truth. Albert, who read everything she wrote and had opinions about most of it, said once that she wrote about the West the way it needed to be written about, as a real place with real people in it, rather than as a legend. She had kissed him for that. In the autumn of 1892, Tom turned 9 and began asking his father to teach him to rope, which Albert did on the weekends with the patient, systematic method he brought to teaching anything. James, 5, wanted to learn too, and in deference to his intensity of desire, Albert started him with a smaller loop and shorter rope, which James took to with the focused aggression of a child born to physical activity. Eleanor, at 18 months, watched from the fence with the observational interest that was already a defining characteristic, her dark eyes moving between the rope and the horses and her brothers with an intelligence that made Anna smile every time. Albert on a weekend afternoon with both boys attempting to rope a fence post, while Eleanor watched and Anna sat on the fence in the autumn sun. It was a picture she held in her mind for years, the particular color of the light and the sound of the boys' voices, and Albert's measured voice correcting and encouraging, and the mountains in the distance wearing their first snow. The account books for fiscal year 1892 showed the strongest performance the farm had produced, and Anna spent an evening in December going through the figures and feeling a satisfaction that was partly practical and partly something deeper, the satisfaction of having built, in the face of everything that had tried to prevent it, something that worked and would last. She took the ledger to where Albert was sitting by the fire with a book, sat down next to him, and showed him the final figure. He looked at it for a moment, then he looked at her. "Well," he said. "Well," she said. It was the year's most eloquent exchange of financial analysis. He put his arm around her, and she leaned into his side, and they sat in the firelight with the sound of the Wyoming winter outside, and the sleeping sounds of their house around them. And she thought about October of 1882, about the trunk on the porch and the deed with his name crossed through and hers written in, and about every single thing that had happened since, all of it. The grief and the cold and the hard work and the coffee across his kitchen table, and the February barn, and the silver ring on her finger and Tom's first word and James's laugh and Alina's eyes, all of it accumulated and present in this moment, this evening, this fire, this man. She tilted her head up and kissed him on the jaw, which made him look down at her with the expression she had loved since before she had known she loved it. "I'm going to say something," she said. "All right," he said. "I have thought sometimes," she said, "about what my life would have looked like if you hadn't left that deed, if I had gotten on that stage, and I cannot quite imagine it. I try to see myself in the room off my sister's kitchen, and I can form the image, but it has no reality to it. It feels like a picture of someone else." He was quiet and attentive, the way he was when she was saying something that mattered. "What I mean," she said, "is that you didn't just save the farm. I know you know that, but I want to say it plainly because I am a woman who believes in saying things plainly. You gave me my life back. Not because you rescued me, I don't mean that. I would have survived without the farm. I'm not the kind of person who stops. But this, what we have, the boys and Alina and this farm and all of it, this is the life I was supposed to have, and I would not have had it without you." He held her gaze for a moment. Then he said, "I had a stake in it too." "I know," she said. "That's the part I love best." He took her face in both his hands, the calloused, careful hands she had known for a decade, and kissed her with the unhurried thoroughness of a man who had been doing this for 10 years, and had never once run out of reasons to mean it. And she kissed him back with the full and certain weight of everything she was, and everything she had become in the years since a deed appeared on her porch on an October morning, and changed the direction she was walking. The farm, in the spring of 1893, was green and full. The creek ran high with snowmelt. The east pasture, the best pasture, was thick with the winter rye that had come up better than any year before. The horses were in the corral, and the cattle were in the north field, and Tom was on his way to school with his lunchbox, and James was trying to persuade Alina to come look at a frog he had found by the creek. And Alina, 2 years old and already entirely clear on what she did and did not want to do, was declining with the cheerful firmness of a child who knows her own mind. Albert came out of the barn and watched this small drama for a moment, and then he walked across the yard to where Anna was standing at the kitchen garden fence, looking at the early shoots coming up in the bed she had turned over last week, and he stood beside her with his shoulder against hers in the easy, comfortable way of people who have stood beside each other long enough that it requires no arrangement. "Alina says no," he said. "Alina often says no," Anna said. "She gets it from me." "I know," he said. She slipped her hand into his, and he curled his fingers around hers, and they stood together looking at the garden and the field beyond it and the mountains beyond that. And the sky above everything was the same impossibly clean Wyoming blue it had been the morning she had stood on this porch with her trunk packed, a decade ago, when she had thought she was leaving and had stayed instead, and had never once, in all the years since, been anything but glad. James came running across the yard with the frog in his cupped hands, shouting for his mother to come see. And Alina came running after him, having apparently changed her mind, and Albert let go of Anna's hand to swing James up into the air, frog and all, which James received as his due. And Alina seized this moment to make a bid for her father's attention by grabbing his boot with both hands and saying his name, which she had recently perfected, with the commanding expectation of a youngest child who understood exactly how much power she wielded. Albert looked down at her over James's head with the helpless gladness of a father of 3, And Anna stood in the Wyoming spring morning and watched her family and felt the full weight and beauty of it. 10 years of staying and building and loving and grieving and laughing and working and choosing every single day to stay. The mountains did not move. The creek ran on. The east pasture shone in the morning light. And Anna Merriweather Fletcher, who had once stood on this porch with her trunk buckled and her face set toward a life she did not want, stood now in the middle of the life she had built and loved every inch of it, and was nothing short of home.